Friday, August 9th. At Tacoma early this morning, Mr. S.E. Moffett of the San Francisco Examiner appeared. He is Mark's nephew and resembles his uncle very much. On his arrival, Mark took occasion to blaspheme for a few minutes, that his relative might realize that men are not all alike. He cursed the journey, the fatigues and annoyances, winding up by acknowledging that if everything had been made and arranged by the Almighty for the occasion, it could not have been better or more comfortable. But he was not traveling for pleasure, etc. We take the Northern Pacific line from Tacoma to Kalama. This line began service January 5th, 1874, and included runs between Portland and Kalama by steamboat on the Willamette and Columbia rivers. On October 9th, 1884, North Pacific puts the world's second largest ferry, the 338-foot steamboat Kalama, later renamed Tacoma, into service. The ferry transported trains across the Columbia, first from Hunters and later from Goble to Kalama, Washington, from 1884 until 1908. The trains are loaded in their entirety, engine and cars, onto the 3-track ferry and taken across the river. Sometime between 1891 and 1893, the Oregon slip was moved to Goble, which is where we landed. The steamer was brought out from New York by the American ship Tilly E. Starbuck, her manifest showing the ferry boat to consist of 57,159 separate pieces. She was put together at Portland and launched May 17th by Smith Brothers and Watson, and was handled on her trial trip by Captain E. W. Spencer. She was christened the Kalama, but is now known as the Tacoma. Captain George Gore was placed in command of the steamer, with Charles Gore chief engineer, and that they are both still holding these positions is a high compliment to their ability as steamboatmen. Other members of the crew for several years past and present time are William Simpson and A.F. Hedges, pilots, John Larson and Thomas Poppington, mates, William Lewis, Elias Vickers, Joseph Collier, and Michael O'Neill, engineers. The Tacoma's dimensions are length 338 feet, beam 42 feet, depth 11 feet 7 inches, engines 36 by 108 inches. The history of the area begins with a selection of Kalama, Washington, as the beginning point for the construction of the Pacific Division of the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1870. At least by 1879, there was a landing on the Oregon side of the Columbia River, across from Kalama, known as Enterprise Landing. However, the Northern Pacific Railroad was chartered to construct transcontinental railroad and telegraph lines between Lake Superior and Puget Sound, and completing the connection required a Portland to Kalama route. In 1877, Oregon Senator John Mitchell sponsored legislation calling for the Northern Pacific to forfeit 7 million acres of land grants unless they completed a line to Kalama as far as practicable along the Oregon side of the Columbia River. The bill didn't pass Congress, but on September 8, 1883, the last spike was driven at Gold Creek, Montana, to close the gap in the Rocky Mountain Division section of the Northern Pacific Railroad. A special train celebrating the opening of the transcontinental line arrived in Tacoma on September 13, 1883, which had traveled over the Portland-Hunters line. The train ferry Tacoma would go into service the following year. The Goble area was most likely a stop for the Lewis and Clark expedition, first settled by Daniel P. Goble in 1853. He took up a donation land claim and later sold it to George S. Foster, who laid out a town and named it after Goble. Goble had a post office from 1894 to 1960. The history of the area is complicated because there are 5 or 6 different community names applied to at least 3 locations in close proximity to each other, all dating to about the same era. These names include Hunters, Reuben, Goble, Moorville, Redtown, Enterprise, aka Enterprise Landing, and arguably Beaver Homes. Hunters, being the railroad ferry site, was also the site of the first post office in the area, called Hunters, which was established May 29, 1888. Hunters was a location about 2 miles south of present-day Goble, and was soon abandoned by the Northern Pacific Railroad in favor of a new slip at Goble. There is no good record of when the move was made, but the Hunters post office was closed to Reuben in October 1893, and Goble was platted in 1891. In 1908, the Northern Pacific extended its Tacoma-Kalama main line south to Vancouver in order to make use of the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, Vancouver-Portland line, and discontinues the newly obsolete ferry service between Kalama and Goble. Northern Pacific also changes the operation of its premier passenger train, the North Coast Limited. Rather than continuing to run the train in a single section from the Twin Cities to Tacoma and then on to Portland, the consist is now broken into 2 sections at Pasco, one running over Stampede Pass on the Northern Pacific Main Line and terminating in Seattle, the other running along the Columbia River via the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway to terminate in Portland. Similarly, the Portland-bound portion of the Great Northern's Oriental Limited is diverted from the Union Pacific-controlled Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company to the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway. Mark and I reached Portland on time, 8:22, and found the Markham Grand packed with a waiting audience and the sign, "Standing Room Only," out. The lecture was a grand success. After it, Mark's friend Colonel Wood, formerly of the United States Army, gave a supper at the Portland Club, where about 24 of the leading men were entertained for 2 hours with Mark's storytelling. They will remember that evening as long as they live. There is surely but one Mark Twain.